Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to peel back the massive cultural dominance of a certain Hollywood masterpiece to uncover the expansive, complex, and honestly wildly different literary universe created by L. Frank Baum. Look, we all know the Yellow Brick Road, the Flying Monkeys, and the Timeless Songs, right? But the original 1900 novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is a vastly different beast than the movie that eventually eclipsed it. Actually, scratch that, it's more like a completely different universe. Today, we're diving into the fascinating depths of Baum's original vision, some hidden political allegories, and the massive literary franchise that started it all.
Okay, let's just kick things off by completely shattering a cinematic illusion you probably grew up with. Did you know the famous ruby slippers were actually a Hollywood lie? I know, it sounds like absolute blasphemy, but the most iconic footwear in cinema history wasn't born from the author's imagination at all. It was literally born in a Hollywood studio. So here's the deal. In L. Frank Baum's original novel, Dorothy is gifted a pair of pristine, magical silver shoes. Not ruby, silver. But when the 1939 movie went into production, the filmmakers quickly realized that silver just wouldn't pop on screen. So they changed them to ruby red purely to show off the vibrant, incredibly expensive new capabilities of Technicolor. It was a brilliant cinematic move for sure, but it completely erased a core structural element of the original text. Furthermore, the book has absolutely no black and white farmhand intro. You know, those Kansas farmhands who conveniently look exactly like the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion? Yeah, they don't exist in the novel. In the book, the cyclone hits on page 1, and Dorothy actually travels to a real, physical place. She isn't unconscious with a head injury. She is literally stranded in a magical geography. In fact, she spends weeks, maybe even months, navigating Oz. Time passes so realistically that when she finally gets back to Kansas, Uncle Henry has had time to build a completely new farmhouse on the foundation of the old one. Baum's original text also highlights the wizard's manipulative nature far more than the movie ever did. In the film, the Emerald City is this glittering, awe-inspiring green metropolis. But in the book, it's a total facade. When Dorothy and her friends arrive, the guardian of the gates forces them to put on mandatory spectacles that are literally locked onto their heads with a key. Why? Because the city is actually just a normal white city. The glasses just make everything look green. The wizard is a con man from the very beginning, using forced perspective to maintain his illusion of power. And finally, let's talk about the ultimate villain. The Wicked Witch of the West barely even appears in the book. She doesn't stalk Dorothy throughout the entire journey. She only shows up when Dorothy actually invades her specific territory out in the West. Oh, and she definitely isn't a green-skinned woman riding a broomstick. In the novel, she is a grotesque cyclops with one giant, all-seeing eye right in the center of her forehead. No way, right? Part 1. Dorothy's true literary journey. Once we strip away all those Hollywood alterations, what kind of story was L. Frank Baum actually trying to tell? Well, Baum aimed to write a modernized fairy tale. In his own introduction, he explicitly stated his goal was to retain wonderment and joy while entirely leaving out the heartaches and nightmares that were so typical of, say, the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen. He was so struck by the creative flow of this world that he even claimed the story was divinely inspired, saying he felt like an instrument for a greater message. Because of that, Dorothy's actual Odyssey is far more grueling and expansive geographically than a quick 2-day musical jaunt. She treks from the east, where her house lands, to the center of the country to find the Emerald City, way out to the west to defeat the witch, and finally, and this is a whole sequence completely cut from the film, she has to travel entirely to the south. Why? Because Glinda isn't the good witch of the north who greets her at the start. Glinda is the good witch of the south, and Dorothy has to embark on a massive final quest just to find her to get home. So when the humbug wizard from Omaha finally does help Dorothy's friends, he relies entirely on the placebo effect to grant their wishes. It's fascinating. He literally unstuffs the Scarecrow's head and fills it with a mixture of bran, pins, and needles, so he will be, wait for it, sharp. He cuts a hole in the Tin Woodman's chest and inserts a literal silk heart stuffed with sawdust, and he pours a liquid potion into a dish for the lion, just telling him it's liquid courage. The wizard knows he has zero real magic, but man, he understands psychology beautifully.
The original text is absolutely packed with these quirky, magical specifics that were cut from later adaptations, often because they replaced CGI impossible moments with practical movie magic. For instance, the crew isn't saved from the deadly poppy field by a magical snowfall. They're rescued by the queen of the field mice, who commands thousands of literal mice to physically drag the sleeping lion out of the flowers. And when they finally meet the wizard, he doesn't just appear as a floating head, he appears completely differently to each character. A giant head to Dorothy, a lovely lady to the Scarecrow, a terrible beast to the Tin Woodman, and a ball of fire to the lion.
But, Baum didn't build this world entirely alone, and we really must acknowledge W. W. Denslow. Denslow was the illustrator, but he was truly a co-creator here. He invented the visual aesthetics of the world in places where Baum's text lacked descriptions. He was so integral to the project that they shared the copyright, and Denslow personally paid the printing costs just so the book could feature lavish, full-color illustrations, a huge financial risk at the time that obviously paid off immensely.
Part 2. A populist political allegory.
Academics frequently map Oz onto the American framework of the 1890s silver crisis, turning the fairy tale into a strict historical metaphor. So, to give you some context, during the Panic of 1893, the United States was plunged into a severe economic depression. This sparked a massive, highly polarized political debate over whether the U.S. currency should be backed strictly by the gold standard or if it should include silver to inflate the money supply and help out the struggling working class and farmers.
Now look at how neatly Baum's magical elements align with this populist movement. Scholars point out that the humbug wizard represents a failing U.S. president trying to be all things to all people but ultimately powerless. The scarecrow represents the American farmer, convinced he lacks the brains to understand complex finance. The Rusted Tin Woodman represents the dehumanized industrial worker. And Dorothy? She's literally walking on a yellow brick road, representing the gold standard, while wearing pristine silver shoes, representing the bimetallic silver standard that populist politicians believed would lead the country out of its economic troubles. Whether intentional or not, it maps the working class's struggles against corrupt, illusionary leadership incredibly seamlessly.
Part 3. The Expanded Oz Universe. Let's move on because, believe it or not, the first book was literally just the prologue to an immense literary universe. If you thought Dorothy's story ended when she clicked her heels, you are missing out on an absolute epic.
14. That is how many full-length Oz novels Baum actually wrote before his death in 1919. He initially intended to stop after just a few, but the fan mail from children was so overwhelming, he just kept returning to the marvelous land of Oz.
And here's a really fun fact about how Baum framed himself to his readers. He didn't present himself as a fantasy author. He styled himself as the royal historian of Oz. He claimed that Oz was a very real place right here on Earth, and that Dorothy, who eventually moved to Oz permanently, by the way, was communicating these histories directly to him using a wireless telegraph. It was a brilliant marketing tactic that made the world feel incredibly alive and tangible to his young readers.
These sequels expanded the mythology immensely, bringing in bizarre new characters and sprawling political conflicts far beyond the Yellow Brick Road. In fact, Dorothy isn't even the main character in the second book. We meet Jack Pumpkinhead, a walking wooden figure with a carved pumpkin head. We meet Tick-Tock, one of literature's earliest mechanical men, who literally needs to be wound up with a key to think, speak, and walk. And we meet the Gnome King, an earth elemental who is constantly trying to invade Oz from underground. The scope is just massive.
And Oz quickly became an institution that outlived its creator. When Baum passed away, his publishers definitely didn't want the golden goose to die, so they hired Ruth Plumley Thompson, who picked up the mantle of royal historian and wrote 21 additional official Oz sequels all by herself. The franchise sustained a massive literary output that lasted for decades, with multiple authors contributing to the canon long before modern cinematic universes ever existed. By the time the original book entered the public domain in 1956, it had sold over 3 million copies. It wasn't just a popular book. It was a foundational American mythology, completely ingrained in the cultural fabric well before Judy Garland ever sang a single note about rainbows. Which leaves us with one final, kind of provocative question about the royal historian's legacy. If Oz wasn't a dream like the movie told us, where on earth is it? L. Frank Baum built a world so meticulously detailed, so grounded in its own bizarre internal logic, and so rich in hidden history that you can't help but want to look for it. I really hope this explainer has shattered those cinematic illusions enough to inspire you to go back and read the incredible, weird, original text for yourself. Thanks for joining me on this journey down the real Yellow Brick Road.